afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News, produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some news stories that have been coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Amelia. My name's Peter. I'm a solicitor. I'm the Managing Director at Digital Law, and we've got quite a few things to cover in terms of some high-profile stories and also some more sort of special interest ones that you may not have seen. So I'll pass back to Amelia so we can start off the analysis.
Thanks, Peter. So our first story of the week, I don't even think we could even go for the Digital Law News without mentioning this story. So this is the Jonny Depp and Amber Heard libel case. No doubt you've heard that a US jury has found that Amber Heard defamed ex-Jonny Depp with an article in which she claimed she was a victim of domestic abuse. So jurors awarded Mr. Depp, who denied abusing Miss Heard, the equivalent of £12 million in compensatory and punitive damages. Miss Heard won one of 3 counterclaims against Mr. Depp and was awarded $2 million in compensatory damages. So these Hollywood stars were divorced in 2017. However, they have presented kind of conflicting versions of their relationship throughout this trial. So I will pass over to Peter to continue with this in detail.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, first of all, in case you're sort of thinking, well, what's this got to do with digital legal issues? I think it's the fact that it's these cases, both this story and also the trial that took place in 2021 in the UK, where Jonny Depp also sued a UK newspaper in relation to an article that had been published about his divorce and marriage, where Amber Heard was required to give evidence but wasn't actually a party. Both of these cases have been in effect about Jonny Depp trying to clear his name, saying these things have been printed about me online. They have defamed me, and in a very real way. The reason why he's saying why the losses are so big is because then he's missed out on work. He was, of course, dropped from the Fantastic Beasts franchise, and can also point to saying, well, look, there are other film roles that I might have had, and other opportunities that may have come my way, were it not for the negative news stories about me that have meant that studios, in quite a real sense, wouldn't touch him with a barge pole. So it's got to the point, I think the only thing he's maintained is one of the perfume endorsements. I think they were one of the few ones to have actually, I say perfume, aftershave endorsements that he's stuck with. I think they're one of the few companies to have stayed with him during all of this. So he's then attempted to clear his name, failed when he sued the newspaper in the UK last year. That was a trial in front of a judge. It is, I think, almost 20 years since we last had a libel trial with a jury in the UK. So in that instance, it was felt to be a matter that was more appropriate to be heard by a judge in isolation. So the judge listens to it and then hands down his judgment several months later, saying this is what I think. And on that occasion, he didn't agree with Depp. But in this instance, we've had it in the US, where it's been a full-on trial, 7 jurors. And last week, one of the foremen of the jury stood up and said, look, we did not agree with Amber Heard on most of those claims. You can, as has been the case with all of this footage, it's all available online. So I know many people who've lost countless hours following this trial and listening to the ins and outs of it on Court TV, I think the US network. So it's all been there to listen to in a very real sense. Again, the UK trial in London, that was, of course, all behind closed doors with really weird artists' impressions of what was being said and done behind those closed doors. So the point here is that Depp has cleared his name. There is already talk of him now starring in more movies as a result. And since then, it's now been muted this week that he might turn around and say, I'm going to waive the damages from Amber Heard, to say, look, she doesn't have to pay this, in return for her then dropping any potential appeal, because it's clear that actually this wasn't really about the money as far as Depp's concerned. It was more about clearing his name and being able to continue working in the highly lucrative American Hollywood film industry. That's what this was all about. It looks like that is now happening again. So really, compared to the tens of millions that he stands to get for individual movie roles, 8 million is really a drop in the ocean. And indeed, paying that 8 million, it seems that looking at Amber Heard's assets, it's highly unlikely she could actually afford to pay it anyway. And that would certainly clear her out from the $7 million divorce settlement that she received under the terms of her divorce from Johnny Depp. And of course, that original settlement was supposed to have then been paid to charities. And it's understood that those payments haven't been made because, of course, she was being sued in a multi-million-dollar libel trial.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story, I think we've mentioned the last few weeks about the new ICO Commissioner, John Edwards. And so John Edwards has called for the criminal justice sector to immediately stop collecting excessive amounts of personal data from victims of rape and serious sexual assault cases. So this call is published in the Commissioner's opinion, which informs the sector on how to use victims' personal data in compliance with data protection laws. So under the current system, victims are being told to consent to hand over extraordinary amounts of information about their lives in the immediate aftermath of a life-changing attack. The ICO found in the UK asked victims to consent to accessing significant amounts of data, known as the Stafford Statement in England and Wales, which gives police access to victims' information that can include information from school records, medical histories, and social service records, which are all very, very in-depth kind of personal data. So the UK Information Commissioner expects this practice to stop immediately and also makes recommendations about how to handle this information in the future. So I'll pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. I think this is a really interesting statement from the Information Commissioner because in effect they're saying that these data collection practices are not good practice. At the moment, if anyone, if they, someone presents to the police with a complaint of rape, they are, in the words of the victims, very much almost treated as the person who was at fault somehow. So, having to hand over your phone, your records, potentially handing over, information from your school records, full medical history, any social service records. So, for example, if someone's been in care or if they've been in contact with a local authority, huge amounts of information are potentially gathered. And it begs the question, what on earth does that have in relation to a criminal offence that someone's been subject to? And this is one of the issues in the UK at the moment, is that it is widely felt that there's a massive underreporting of rape to the police, and that then of the crimes that are reported, the victims tend to be, this is part of the treatment they tend to get, which is pretty horrifying on the back of a fairly horrifying experience in the first place that tends to act as a massive disincentive to report. And then at the very end of it, you're looking at only a few % of all reported rapes actually finding their way through to conviction at the end. So again, most of the victims tend to think, well, why should I bother? Because I'll only go through all of this. I won't be believed. I'll be asked to sort of lay out my entire life for an entire court to look at. And then they probably won't even find the perpetrator guilty. By making, I think, this quite a good opinion, I think the ICO is trying to roll back and just to say, look, the police should not think, oh, we have to do this on the grounds of data protection, making it very clear it ain't anything to do with the ICO in terms of this massive, invasive lack of privacy that victims have when it comes to this. And if anything, I mean, he actually says here, victims are being treated as suspects and people feel re-victimized by a system they expect to support them. I think that's absolutely hitting the nail on the head. The system should be supporting victims. It should not be actually putting them through an experience that makes the whole thing even worse, which is quite an achievement in terms of how the system is currently treating people. It's quite abhorrent, really, how people are being treated. So hopefully this will mean that there starts to be a pushback amongst the law enforcement agencies to start treating victims of crime and victims of rape differently than the way it currently seems to be the case.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story, this is kind of moving away from the UK in itself and over to India. So India's loan scams have been leaving victims scared for their lives. So this is a BBC story looking specifically at this person who initially went to an app to try and get some money. This app then lent him a sum. This wasn't quite the sum of money he'd asked for, but he took it anyway. It was the best he was going to get. And then when it came to repayment, the individual was asked to repay a higher sum than he initially had taken out. And due to this, he then consequently went to another scam app in order to top up this. So you can see that there's a vicious circle here. And so this type of mobile phone scam has become very common in India. Between the 1st of January 2020 and the 31st of March 2021. A study by the Reserve Bank of India identified 600 illegal lending apps. And during that period, the state recorded the highest number of complaints relating to lending apps, with 572 reported. And I will pass over to Peter to kind of talk to you in depth as to why loan app scams can be on the rise here.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is an absolutely fascinating story. I couldn't help but make a comparison between what's happening in India here and then the situation in the UK, where there is also a lot of fraud and scams that are being perpetrated. The difference is the type. I mean, the sheer volume here: 600 illegal lending apps. The credit market is much more highly regulated in the UK. I am not for a minute saying it's perfect. But certainly there are, if you are an authorised lender, then you have to be regulated. You've got the Financial Conduct Authority, you've got the Bank of England, and there is an element of regulation that means that there should only be good authorised lenders in the market. Where you have a less regulated market, there is more scope for then these sort of illegal apps to start up, and then not only are they might the actual lender itself not be acting in a authorized regulated manner, then we've got potentially illegal scam practices, offering the money and then changing the rate of interest, changing the repayment terms, bullying those who've applied for finance. All of these sorts of practices then end up taking place. Now, in the UK, law enforcement is frankly at sea very often when it comes to dealing with scams and frauds. They simply don't have the resources, but the Indian police are similarly under-resourced, and they're trying to deal with, policing over 1 billion people. And in a similar way, they simply don't have the resources to stay on top of this either. So there is a real issue with regards to these apps that are proliferating. And I think it's also worth just talking briefly about the fact that the way the Indian economy has grown is quite fascinating when you look at it. Digitally, it is very mature. You've got whole areas of the country where, with such a vast country, it was very expensive to roll out things like hard phone lines, and then to start rolling out fibre internet. So that's very much confined to the cities. And India is a vast country, and therefore very often people's main way of getting online has been through mobile phone use. So in some areas, phone lines, internet never got out there in terms of the more traditional through fibre or a line connection. And instead, the first experience people then have of getting online is through a phone or mobile device. So that's one of the reasons why it's grown so rapidly, is the fact they've skipped the analog bit and gone straight into being digital native straight from the start. So therefore, digital mobile device use is very, very high, and the market is actually quite mature as a result. So therefore, there's an awfully large market of people out there to be targeted by the fraudsters. And you can potentially make an awful lot of money from an awful lot of users, and you've then got a law enforcement and a regulatory environment that simply isn't adequately resourced to be able to properly police and keep people safe. And as I say, I'm not for a minute saying that the UK is any better, but I'm saying that when you look at the fact that when it comes to the resources, trying to then properly regulate this proliferation of hundreds and hundreds of apps it's a massive, almost overwhelming task, frankly. And that certainly seems to be the position there. I mean, there's a comment from the Special Inspector General of Police, and they've got a cyber department, but you can imagine, how do you properly police, over 1 billion users online who are potentially trying to access loans, who need the credit, and are then being ripped off. As I say, it's frankly overwhelming for them, and I think it's interesting to then look and see, well, that's the case in India. I'd be interested to know if it's a similar case in other rapidly developing economies. China develops sort of 7, 8, 9% a year. Have they had similar problems there? Is the state there more effective at clamping down on these sorts of practices, as is sometimes the case in authoritarian state versus a democracy, for example? But certainly for a democracy, it's clear here that as the world's largest democracy, India is struggling to be able to adequately police and regulate the digital sphere here.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story. And so I think pretty much for the last few weeks, we have spoken about Twitter every episode, and this episode is just the same. So we have a slight update on the kind of Elon Musk buys Twitter. So Twitter have agreed to share a vast trove of data about the content on its platforms with Musk after Musk threatened to abandon his 44 billion acquisition of the company if it did not provide more information about fake accounts and bots. And so while this information may be being provided, it's unclear actually what Musk will actually have access to and what this information may actually help him with. And equally, Musk's lawyer has also said that the third parties reviewing this data will have to adhere to NDA agreements, and any information that has been gathered as a result of this will not be able to be retained due to the competitively sensitive nature of the information if the deal does not close. So I will pass over to Peter to unpick this a little bit more.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is the story of the gift that keeps on giving, isn't it? I mean, it's getting to the point now that this issue around fake accounts and automated bots on Twitter is clearly an important one. If you're about to spend 44 billion buying the platform, you probably want to know, well, how many of the few 100 million users we've got, how many of them are actually human? How many are, politicians, celebrities, and various people with blue ticks? And journalists following those celebrities for clickbait news stories. How many of them are real? How many of what is admittedly for a social network really a comparatively small user base, how many of those users, active users, are actually fake? And it's interesting that clearly Twitter cannot answer that question. And I am wondering if they're making a big deal here out of the information they're going to provide. And you wonder, is the reason you don't want this information to get out is that you actually simply don't know how many of your users are actually fake, and that figure of 5% is plucked out of thin air. That's what I suspect the situation is, and they can't actually be sure. Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 1%? I think the brutal truth here is they simply don't know, because when Twitter was being set up, they would never have envisaged the possibility of a totally fake automated AI operating an account. And yet in reality, this is what's happening across social media, where you get these automated accounts on different platforms. And it's everything from scams to collecting data to potentially influencing society and elections that's taking place here. But the point is that you can understand why Elon Musk is wanting to check this. It's an essential point of due diligence. Buyer beware. What is it you're actually buying? Am I buying a platform with all of these hundreds of millions of users, or am I buying a massive troll farm? That's what you're wanting to find out. What am I getting for the 44 billion? And increasingly, it's looking like this could be the straw that breaks the camel's back, that stops the deal going through. Better to pay $1 billion and walk away than to pay 44 billion for something that actually is not as useful as it first appeared. I mean, the thing here as well, you can understand why they're saying, well, we want an NDA around this, because can you imagine if it gets out that half of all the users on Twitter are actually fake? It would not only destroy Twitter's share price, we'd be getting to a point where you'd start to think, well, is this actually this platform? I mean, it is incredible when you look at printed media now, traditional newspapers, how many stories come from, oh, so-and-so said on Twitter this, and then here is what people said in response. The Mail Online is full of this lazy journalism where it's been put together by journalists somewhere that are just merely looking at tweets, pulling it together and trying to make a story. And if it came out that most of the, if all of those comments and replies are actually coming from automated bots, suddenly it becomes less of a source for journalists. It becomes less credible. Would people stop posting on it? At the moment we seem to have government by tweet. Any policy that's announced, certainly in the UK or the US, it's either done by tweet or it's a tweet that hastily follows and again is cut and pasted by the various newspapers. So you really do start to look at it and think this, depending how this story comes out, it could have a catastrophic effect on Twitter. So they're trying to argue, oh, we want to have clear NDAs in place, but you can imagine that it wouldn't surprise me if, given how Elon Musk tends to ignore the rules, he may decide I'm going to walk away and I'll make a public statement as to why I'm walking away, and Twitter be damned in terms of the board and its chief executive. Ooh, this could get exciting.
Thanks, Peter. You're quite correct there. I mean, it seems week on week we get some more information about this. So let's see what the news provides us with next week. Moving on to our next story. This one is looking at the digital fingerprints of 1 million images of child sexual abuse that have been created. And so the Internet Watch Foundation, the IWF, has been responsible for finding and removing such material online. These said fingerprints, known as hashes, would help companies and police find copies of images. It's hoped that by adding these hashes, it will allow the reuse of images to be kind of prevented, and it will kind of help take images offline, obviously. And these hashes are identified by a code produced by an algorithm and act, like I said, as a fingerprint for each image or video. This being said, this all sounds absolutely brilliant until there's kind of this one liner at the bottom that said encrypted images cannot be identified using this algorithm and this list of hashes. So we can see that this is a step in kind of the right direction here, but is it foolproof? Not quite yet. I'll pass over to Peter to continue.
Thanks, Amelia. I think you're right. This is at least a start. I think the proliferation of images like these that are being described of child sexual abuse are one of the real sort of cancers of social media, in particular, where this stuff is being shared. And it's everything from abuse to violence, lots of illegal activities, and this is one corner of it in terms of the child sexual abuse element. But there's a lot of illegal activities where there is discussion, there's commission of things that happen online, and we are getting to a point where it's like, is it actually worth going on to and feeding social networks when one of the outputs is this activity, and then the detrimental effect that has on society in general around the world? We really are at a tipping point. So from that point of view, for the Internet Watch Foundation to say, well, look, we can actually identify these things through a sort of digital fingerprint and then use that to be able to take these images down, that has to be a good thing. If it becomes a more straightforward way for law enforcement, regulators, whoever, to be able to intervene and get this stuff taken down and in a very real way clean up the internet. But as you say, it can't identify encrypted images. So you'll be able to get the stuff that's been lazily left in on different platforms, but the stuff that's behind an encryption barrier, you might not, or if that image itself has been encrypted. So it's a start, but arguably we're going to need more technical tools like this to be able to actually have a shot at being able to take down this sort of stuff, stop its being shared, and stop the proliferation of this stuff online.
Thanks, Peter. Moving on to our next story. I mean, I was quite incredulous when I ran the headline of this story. So, the people are making money from surfing the internet. So, I read this and I was like, surely this is some form of scam. We've already spoken about scams today. And if you're a regular listener, you'll know that these enticing kind of headlines do scream scam. However, I did in fact read on. And so, this is a company based in US and Canada have a beta testing mode, which is linked, works by bypassing the likes of Google, and instead of selling your data directly to kind of to different people, it sells it directly to retail brands. And in return, the kind of app called Surf gives you points that can be saved up and then redeemed for gift cards and discounts. So it's interesting this story has come up because I think a few weeks ago we covered the fact that the average European has their data shared 376 times a day to the likes of companies before it ends up in a retail brand. And this then goes up for US users when their data is shared 747 times a day. And so this idea that people are able to kind of take back control of their data is a very interesting one. So I will pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. Yeah, this is an interesting one, to be able to, in effect, cut out the middleman and sell your data in terms of the pages you look at, the searches that you undertake, your life online, being able to basically sort of share that and sell it. And then it is the user benefiting rather than it being the platform. After all, that's where, I mean, it's quite interesting actually. In the week that Sheryl Sandberg has resigned as chief operating officer at Facebook, having built that from a platform that wasn't really making an awful lot of money into this behemoth that has cornered the advertising market. How did Facebook do that? It did it by hoovering up its users' data, packaging it, and then selling it to various different big brands, and then facilitating very powerful advertising on a platform of billions of users. So in this instance, it's saying cut out the middleman, cut out Google or Facebook, and be able to go to a brand and say, yes, you can have my information, and then you'll collectively earn something. Now, at the moment, the sums are fairly small. It's saying that people on the Surf have been able to make $1.2 million, but you know, how many people is that split between? It's probably pennies per user. But at least people feel they have more control over their online data, and it's highlighting how your data is used and monetized in, I think, quite in a way that I think might surprise the vast majority of users. So as this platform becomes more popular, more people will stop and think, oh, so that's how this has been working for the last decade. Oh, maybe I'll think twice before I open my next account on the next social network to come along. Bear in mind, of course, that a platform like Facebook is now declining in terms of active users, and indeed it's platforms like TikTok that are actively growing, but just a quick reminder that TikTok is owned by a Chinese corporation that is majority influenced and owned by the Chinese state. So imagine, you know, they'll be hoovering up vast amounts of your data, and they aren't bothered by things like the rule of law or the values that we tend to have in the West. So just a little reminder there, in case you are an avid user of TikTok, think very carefully about how your data is being hoovered up and used. But in this instance, at least, this is a way to actually allow users to get back that little bit of control over how they use their data. Take back control. I've heard that phrase somewhere before, I think.
Thanks, Peter. I did find it very interesting in the sense that this is probably the first time I've really seriously considered how companies are able to actually monetize the data that I am sometimes inadvertently providing them with. So it'd be interesting to see whether kind of this idea catches on and taking out the middleman. And even if people are getting kind of pennies for their data, the fact that they are taking back that control. So moving on to our last story of today. We've spoken about AirPods multiple times throughout AirTags throughout this podcast. And this story is no exception. So this is a story based in the US where a girlfriend kills cheating boyfriend by running him over 3 times with her car after tracking him to a bar using Apple AirTags and finding him with another woman. And so this is kind of the classic example of how AirTags can be used for nefarious actions. And while somewhat extreme, it does kind of point out how easy it is to kind of use these devices for something other than their means. So I will pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. And it was actually a good few months ago, I think we first talked about AirTags and the fact that they were being abused. So, people were suddenly finding an AirTag in their vehicle or in their handbag and going, oh, I wonder where that came from. Sure enough, it's someone actually trying to track them without you knowing about it. Apple has, in theory, introduced certain measures to stop them being used as a sort of James Bond style bugging device. But in this instance, that's exactly what this individual chose to do, and they used the AirTag to then follow their boyfriend, tracked him to a bar, and then ended up killing him. Which is, it's fairly brutal, I'm afraid, but it is an example of how this stuff can be used. And I think it's going to lead to an increase in the pressure on Apple to more closely potentially regulate or even withdraw these sorts of products from sale if it is going to lead to either people being unwittingly pursued, followed, surveilled, and then potentially become the victims of crime. Because in effect, this person's been murdered as a result of that, and we've seen, or we've already talked about on this podcast, the idea of, say, people being unwittingly followed and potentially their locations being betrayed to a third party without them knowing, and what that can then lead to. And this is a significant example of what can happen. So it is also, I'm afraid, a bit of a parable about when technology is released and you think, oh, this will be really useful, this will be really helpful to people. No more will you end up wondering where the car keys are or where is your mobile phone because you'll be able to have an AirTag on it. Well, turns out that you can use it for rather more sinister purposes than the very initially positive, pure things that you would have envisaged it for. This happens loads of times. It happens for everything from when governments pass legislation and it turns out to have unintended consequences, through to, in this instance, the actual technology itself having unintended consequences. Doesn't mean you have to carry on doing it. So at some point, we may get to a point whereby Apple ends up disabling this service. Let's see what happens. I think it will depend on if you get a lot of stories like this with the headline has Apple AirTag kills in the headline. So if that happens a lot, you can imagine that Apple will start to think, do we really want to be associated with a product that is leading to the commissioning of crime?
Precisely. I think it is actually worth mentioning here that kind of since the initial story has come out, Apple have actually tried to put things in place to stop Apple AirTags being put on people. I have to, as an Apple user myself, I have noticed in the last few weeks that I own AirPods and they are connected to my phone, and I have been recently leaving them at home and not necessarily been taking them with me. And my device has noticed this and therefore sent me a notification saying, do you realise you've left this device at home? I think that's something that they have actually also implemented on their AirTags, in the sense that your device will recognise if you are carrying a different device with you. For example, I was carrying my brother's AirPods at the same time, and they kind of popped up and say, did you realise that you're also carrying this with you? So it is interesting to see that Apple are trying the operative word, to implement some sort of changes to their devices. However, whether it actually works in the long run, and with stories like this coming out regularly, yeah, it would be interesting to see whether they continue releasing these AirTags.
I think you're right, Amelia. I mean, some of the things they've introduced are saying, for example, the AirTag will only operate when it's at a distance from the device for a finite number of hours. If memory serves, I think that it was like 8 or 9 hours it would function. Before then it would switch off. So the idea is you couldn't surveil someone for a period of days or weeks after putting a tag on them or their clothing or their vehicle. The other thing they were going to do was have it so that the tag would emit a noise if it was then away from the device that's monitoring it and somewhere else for a prolonged period of time, it would start to emit a noise so that the person that is near it would become aware of the fact it was there. Either way, that's not helped the victim in this instance. I think we have to bear in mind, of course, that in this instance, this girlfriend could have ended up following the boyfriend and finding out what he was doing without an AirTag. You can, turns out you can just, in a vehicle trail someone and follow what they're doing and see what happens that way. You don't have to have a surveillance bug from Apple on there. The point is that this was clearly integral to the activity, and it then leads to the negative headline, which may make Apple then think, well, do we want to have lots of headlines saying that our equipment has facilitated a crime? I mean, in this, it might not have done. As I say, you could have had this murder could have happened. I mean, let's face it, if you to something as serious as that doesn't necessarily mean that it was crucial, that the AirTag was crucial to it. The headline's still up there though, and people will associate it with, oh, that person was killed after they were traced using an AirTag. And I'm sure this is not an isolated incident. There will be other crimes like this that happen as well.
Thanks, Peter. So that was our last news story for today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar, and we will be back next week. Just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, and podcast channels as well, such as Spotify and both Amazon and Apple Music. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.